Our speaker for this evening. Thank you, Kim.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you to Grand Lake. I said this morning on the air that Grand Lake is where God's showing off, and He really is, so it's great to be here. Hi, Jackie and Mike. Thank you for all that you have done for this event, and we miss you. So Mark, you and your team have been doing amazing work here, and 14 years. This is hard to believe, so congratulations on that as well. The speakers are amazing, and everybody is learning so much. And yes, my name's Kim Munson. I have a couple of radio shows on KLZ 560 AM. I'm on 6 to 8 AM Monday through Friday. And then those shows are rebroadcast throughout the day, and then we have podcasts. But I used to be in the clothing business. And with the 6 AM hit, I realized that I need to get some new shoes to match the bags under my eyes. My other show is America's Veterans Stories, so that we can hear the stories of our military and our veterans. I went to Normandy, France in 2016 with the group that accompanied 4 D-Day veterans back to Normandy for the 72nd anniversary of the D-Day landings. Realized we need to be telling these stories. So it's my great honor to introduce your speaker this evening. I know him and his beautiful wife, Keeland, very well. And in fact, Alan Thomas is a regular guest on the show. And it took me, about 6.5 years before I said, okay, I might give the microphone over to somebody else if I'm traveling, because we were having some technical difficulties, and the station manager said, Kim, it's okay to have a guest host. So I asked Alan to be a guest host, and they gave the mic over to him, and he's done a great job with that as well when I'm traveling, so thank you. Really appreciate it. Somebody said to me that the Washingtons, as George Washington was born old. And I thought, well, what do they mean by that? And I think they meant that they were born wise. And I think that that's what I can say about Alan Thomas. He is a young man. They have, 4-year-old and 2-year-old? And the 4-year-old had a tooth challenge today, so it's so great that Keeland is here tonight because they were a little concerned about that. But I would say that Alan Thomas is one of the wisest people that I know. And so you are in for a real treat tonight. So I'd like to introduce you to Alan Thomas III.
Well, thank you, Kim. With an introduction like that, it's difficult to follow up. So, I was walking in, and Keelan pointed out, I have never seen a Constitution board game, ever. So I am in good company, I think, when I ask this. How many of you have seen the Broadway play Hamilton? Anybody seen Hamilton? How many of you, the second time you saw it, like me, had to put the subtitles on? Yeah. Rap is not my preferred musical genre whatsoever. It's a little difficult for me to understand. So when I watched it through the second time, I was pretty amazed by what the lyrics actually had and how amazing they actually were. Follow-up question to this, maybe, how many of you loved Shakespeare in high school? Anybody love Shakespeare? I married one that loves it. I do not, in fact, so I did not raise my hand. Who just allows authors to make up words? I mean, how difficult is that when you get to just read something and you're like, oh, we just get to make things up now? So I think all of us can relate to the fact that sometimes reading old things can be kind of difficult, right? But does not reading Shakespeare help us learn anything else about life? In other words, Shakespeare helps teach us lessons, gives us stories that are really good to learn, right? We all know that, even though it's difficult to read. And so that's why for a while now, I've been going through this book. And if you've watched Hamilton, you know that Hamilton was never shy to use a lot of words to get his point across, right? So when you look at this book, over 500 pages, and for those of you online, those words are very, very small in this book, right? It's a difficult book to read at times because it was written in a different time. It was written for a different people, and it was written for a very specific purpose. But like Shakespeare, it doesn't mean it doesn't have a lot to teach us about life and, more importantly, about the Constitution as well. You see, back when it was written, our country was at a very critical turning point. We had these Articles of Confederation, which were total malarkey. If you've watched a certain seafaring show, you might say that they're more like a set of guidelines than rules, right? The states were told by the Continental Congress to give money to George Washington, and George Washington said, "Where's my money?" So the Americans all knew the Articles of Confederation weren't working, but they were kind of scared to give more power to a federal government. Sound kind of familiar to what we all kind of feel here today, right? Who wants more federal power right now? So I think you can understand and put yourself in the spirit of the colonists at the time that said, hey, we just fought this war against a tyrant, against a king who wouldn't listen to us, who wouldn't do what we wanted to do. I don't want to do that again, right? So Hamilton comes in and he has this audacious plan, and they've just had this great conclave and come up with this brilliant document that right now might seem pretty brilliant now, but at the time, maybe not so much. There were a lot of states that weren't on board with the idea of the Constitution. And so Hamilton got together and he said, hey, Madison, hey, John Jay, let's go to the most difficult areas we can. Let's go to the states that are most opposed to the Constitution and try and convince them it's a good idea. Ironically, New York, right? So they had this plan to come in here and to say, here's what the Constitution is, here's why it's a good idea, and this is why you should vote for it. Today, why should we care about a set of newspaper articles that try to get the colonists to pass a document that we already follow today? Well, I would argue we're facing a little bit of a constitutional illiteracy crisis, are we not? And not just from one side of the political aisle, we're facing it from the entire gambit of people that say, I think I have a better idea of how to write the Constitution. I have a better idea of, why didn't they do this when they had the opportunity? Why didn't they include this little provision? Because I know best, I know better than this group of people that lived 250 years ago that couldn't even dream of what a car probably was. I know better, we have more experience now, so what can I learn from them? Plus, it's really hard to read. It takes a lot of time to get through it. It's not just enough anymore to understand what the Constitution is. It's more important now, more than ever, to know why the Constitution is and how the Constitution works, and also why they did it the way they did it. You see, he spends 500 words to talk about a document that I could probably rewrite within an hour. Because the brevity of that document is so important, because it contains so much logic and reasoning and deliberation and argument and debate and compromise that he wanted to make sure that we pass it along. So why do we have a Constitution? And it's kind of a fair statement, because a lot of what we talk about most of the time is actually the Declaration of Independence, isn't it? These rights are self-evident. That's not in the Constitution. Instituting governments for men, abolishing the ties that bind us together, that's all in the Declaration of Independence. So they needed a way to say, hey, we had this great document, we had this great declaration, we fought this war, and now we're under this Articles of Confederation that isn't working at all. So how can we go back to the drawing table and make sure that this grand vision, this grand idea, actually gets implemented and passed along for 250 years? Well, one of the things, and we'll put a pin in this, is we have to understand that human nature plays a big role in everything the Constitution is about. Because at the time, they just came under the auspices of a tyrant and a tyrannical government that didn't care about their rights as colonists and colonies. And so they said, how can we prevent that tyranny from happening again in our country? How can we prevent that sort of mob rule from happening here in this country? And they said, well, what leads to mob rule? How can you prevent mob rule at all? Well, the first way is pretty obvious, right? How can you maintain cohesive thought across a nation to prevent mob rule? Well, you can become a tyrant and tell everybody you better think this way or else, right? That makes a lot of people think the same way. We could say, well, if everybody just thought the same way, then we don't have to worry about mobs, right? But we're humans, so that's not really a good solution to that question, right? So they sat there and they said, well, maybe one of the best ways we can do it is we can try and best control the effects of mob rule. We've thought about all the other different ways to control mob rules. We've thought about all the different ways to try and prevent tyranny from happening. So maybe the best way is just to prevent the effects of a mob rule. And that's really important because our Constitution is based a lot on incentives and prevention more than proactive intervention, right? So how can we balance this? Because, again, the Constitution really balances these two different sides. One side is complete anarchy. As Madison writes in some of the Federalist Papers, you can actually have so much freedom that you limit your federal government to absolutely nothing. And that's not helpful. If your federal government isn't able to protect its border, to stop people from coming in, well, it's not achieving its proper role, right? So too much freedom for the individual or for the states means that the federal government no longer has enough ability to do its proper job. So we have anarchy on one side, and at the time, they were really fighting with this idea of state sovereignty. Because, and bear with me here because we've lost a little bit of it, a lot of people really liked their states. They really liked where they lived. A lot of them had given up everything, moved over here, set up land, started building a future for their family, and now they said, well, I've devoted a lot of time to this state. I've put in a lot of sweat, tears, blood. I like what I have going on here. I don't want a federal government coming in and messing this all up. So there's this push and pull throughout the Federalist Papers, throughout the founding of our country, of how much is too much for the federal government, and how can we make sure and tell you guys, we like what you did with the states, we like what you did with your state constitutions, we're not going to come in too fast, too hard into your states and prevent all the good that you've already done. Because the founders did look at this as a republic, right? And one of the nice things about a republic is you try and limit the governance to the closest level of the individual. Now, we take that for granted, right? We think this local governance idea, since we've lived with it for so long, wasn't as revolutionary as it was at the time. And that's one of the points they made very early on when they're trying to convince everyone to adopt this Constitution, is they said, no, this is a little different than the republics of old. This is a little different from the republics that we read about in Greece, and this is a little different from all the other governments that they tried across Europe. Because instead of picking out a favorable class to rule us, instead of picking out a section to govern us, we're actually going to extend this thing to everybody. we're going to say that the citizens have to be in charge of their own government, which was pretty new. That was a new concept not tried before. That's a new concept in the science of governance that they talk about that they hadn't tried before. And that's where they introduced this very interesting word. The word responsibility really hadn't been used in the lexicon of governments and talking about politics really until our founding fathers started talking about it. This idea of responsibility is a two-way street, right? It means we can't just sit there and say, oh, what they do at the federal level, we'll let them do that. I'm just going to take care of me and number one and my family over here and maybe a couple neighbors. I'll care more about them. They said, no. You have a responsibility to hold your government accountable. And your government has the responsibility to fulfill its promises to you. And that was a very important point to be made to the colonists because, again, throw yourself all the way back there. What did the Declaration say that Britain was not doing correctly? They said, you're taxing us without representation, but also, if you read most of the grievances in the Declaration of Independence, it says, you're not governing us. You're not appointing judges in the right place. You're not letting us meet together and hold governing councils even remotely close to where we are. You're not governing us correctly. We're being judged by people that we don't even live with, if we're being judged at all, if the judicial process is even being followed all the way over here in the colonies. And so our founding fathers said this idea of responsibility is very, very important. Because if you're going to make a promise to hold the federal government responsible, the federal government better be responsible and fulfill the promises it made to you. So, how do we do that? What does the Constitution do in order to try and achieve that purpose? Well, one of the ways, I don't know about you, incentives drive life pretty well, don't they? If you were to try and incentivize me right now to run a marathon by saying, hey, Alan, go run a marathon, I'd say, nah. That doesn't sound like fun to me, right? If you said, hey, Alan, if you don't run a marathon, I'm going to burn your house down, I'd be more inclined to run a marathon, wouldn't I? Incentives work because we understand what incentives do. So the question they grappled with pretty mightily, especially when how to construct our government, is what incentives do you make? And how do you make those incentives work in our favor? Remember, going back to the first point, if we're going to control the effects of a mob, how do you incentivize people not to be a mob? How do you incentivize a mob not to trample all over the rights of other people? How do you incentivize a majority of people saying, a majority of you saying, hey, Alan, we want your wallet, we want your money inside of it, and since there's more of us than there is of you, just hand it on over. Well, you have to create incentives. You have to have a wonderful document like the Declaration of Independence telling everybody, telling the majority that they have rights. But you have to create this incentive structure to have them compete against each other. And of course, the executive branch really takes seat number one throughout the Federalist Papers. And it should be fairly obvious, right? The executive branch is most like a king. Throughout this book, Publius, who's the pseudonym that Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, that's the pseudonym they used. Publius makes the argument, hey, you're comparing this executive branch to a king too often. But it's also kind of a fair analysis. because the executive is inclined to do kingly things. The executive will be inclined, and it's necessary for it to do things that a king typically would. Now, the easiest example is Hamilton had a little bit of an axe to grind with all of the colonies when it came to the war effort, because he was the aide-de-camp of Washington, and if we study our history, we know Washington was a general first and foremost, yes, but it seemed like the second most often performed task he did was writing letters saying, I need more money and I need more authority and I need more men. And Hamilton was sitting there, right there with him saying, we are going to lose this war because the Continental Congress can't do what they promised us to do. They're so scared of creating a king in Washington, or they are so unwilling to do it because the state doesn't want to give up the rights, or the states are so broke and they notice other states not giving money that they said, we'll get to that if we can. The southern states even said, hey, that's not my backyard. That's all happening away from there. Why should I give money to a fight that's not happening in my backyard? So Hamilton said, you know what, guys? This cool thing we're doing, this revolutionary new government, this idea we're embarking upon, nearly didn't work for the very reason that you guys oppose giving any sort of power to a king. So we need to give a little bit more energy there. We need to allow the executive a little more energy. That's a weird word, isn't it? Saying we want our government to be more energetic. Again, that's kind of why it makes it difficult to read, because we don't think about that. But we need to enable our government to be able to move quicker and faster. And with the Articles of Confederation, the government couldn't move hardly at all. And so he really had to fight hard. And again, I think this group is more friendly to this idea. He had to fight against a group saying we need to give more power to the federal government and convince them it was a good idea. But all of us here kind of get to Monday morning quarterback it a little bit. So I think it's difficult at times to understand that this was actually a good idea. Because if we were to go to war tomorrow, if somebody declared war on us tomorrow, say Canada got all spunky, right? And they said, hey, you know what? We're going to do it this time. Let's see what we can do with those American people. And they jump across our border, and we didn't have a president. We didn't have an executive branch. What would that look like? You think Congress would move fast enough to declare war, to figure out who the generals are, to apportion money to our wonderful men and women in the military? No? Right. I mean, they could barely pass a budget nowadays, much less go to war, right? So there is a good thing to have somebody in charge of war. It is a good thing in times of emergencies that we have one person making decisions. And not just the fact that it is one person making decisions, but we have one person accountable for those decisions, responsible for those decisions, because again, we get to hold them responsible for those decisions, right? It's our responsibility to say, hey, last time there was an emergency, you didn't do too good. And we're going to make sure that we know you know it. So we're going to kick you out, and hopefully the next person that comes along knows how bad you did that, so you don't do it again. But there was going to be this incentive structure for the executive branch to say, hey guys, I want to do something. It's an emergency. Hey guys, I want to do this. So it's an emergency. You should give me power. It's a good idea to give me power. And now that I have the power, I can do what I want, right? So how do they curb that incentive in our Constitution? They say, yeah, you can have the emergency power, but the legislative branch is going to want to stop that at all costs. Because the legislative branch is going to want to have the power and you not to have it. So we'll have the legislative branch be in charge of declaring wars. You can be responsible for carrying them out. And so you can see they created this incentive structure within our own government to butt heads, to really fight each other a lot, unless it was for the common good of the country. Unless the legislature said, yeah, Canada can't do that, and Canada, we love you. This is just a hypothetical example because you're close. So yeah, we're going to give authority to do that. But if it wasn't a good idea, the legislature would say, whoa, you went way beyond what you should. So we want the power back. We don't want the executive to always be in an emergency. So we're going to take the power back and we're going to curb your ability to do that. Oh, by the way, the cool thing they also did is they said, hey, the legislative is in charge of the money. Much to maybe a little bit to Hamilton's chagrin, but maybe not then. Because even though they lived through this war, this was not something they just sat down in a room like this and hammered out in the course of an hour and a half or less, depending on how many questions they had. This was something they got stuck in a hot, muggy room with windows closed, so nobody could even listen in and report on it. They argued about this. They debated about this. They said, no, that's not a good idea. That is a good idea. You're an idiot. No, you're an idiot. These weren't things that just came together because it makes sense. They came together because they logicked their way to it. They reasoned their way to it, and they saw that as a virtuous thing to do. So how else did they incentivize our federal government? Because, of course, the two main drivers are, of course, the executive and legislative. And, we have the referees, the judicial, but for the most part, their power is pretty limited in scope, right? Let me be specific with that. Was supposed to be limited in scope. They were supposed to be the referee. They were supposed to say, this is the rule book. You violated it. Don't do it again. So the other way they did is they said, okay, you're going to have fights between the executive and the legislative, but we still have that idea of state sovereignty, right? How do we keep the states involved in this federal government? Because we know that the people want their states involved. We know that they want their states to have the power to do what needs to happen in each state. Our founders were wise enough to know that the federal government could not be in charge of 13 states all at once, much less 50. So they said there's going to be certain things that the states have to do themselves, but the federal government is going to want to do that, right? Because as soon as we get legislators up there, they're going to think their job is to pass bills. They're going to want to do things. So how do we stop that from happening? And that's where they created this pretty revolutionary bicameral system, right? Where they said, okay, maybe the best way to do this is we need the government to listen to the people. That's a good thing to happen, right? We need the people's input. They need to be telling us what the federal government should do if we want to make them responsible for their government. Well, we should give them a seat at the table. But how do you do that in a huge republic? Because in a huge republic, you can get this tendency to have the majority dominate, right? You can have the majority that just sits here and says, oh, we're going to do this because, well, it's most of us and you can't stop us. Well, they wanted to balance that with the states. They wanted the states to come in and say, whoa, whoa, whoa. Okay, people, we hear you. We hear your need for that idea, but this is best left to us. They wanted the states to sit here and say, we are the state. We are closest to you. I'm Massachusetts. I'm closest to you. Come to me with your issues because I want to retain the power. They wanted the states to say, keep the power close to you because we're closer to you. and we'll give as little as possible to that federal government, because we don't want that federal government coming anywhere close to what we're allowed to do. So they decided to have them fight by setting up a Senate, which was originally elected by state legislatures. So the Senate was going to really sit back and say, hey, is this a good idea to give power to the states, or is it a good idea to give it to the federal government? And if it was a good idea for the federal government to do it, the Senate would say, okay, it's a good idea. And the House of Representatives would say, hey people, is this a good idea? And their representatives would say, it's a good idea. Let's send it off to the executive. And then they snuck in this sneaky little thing saying, hey, if the one elected executive doesn't like what they're doing, he can just axe the whole thing. He could say, no, you're trying to take too much power from me, legislative branch. I don't like that. I'm going to axe it. But again, is that good enough? Is it good enough for one elected person to be in charge of everything, or have the power to axe everything at his or her will and whim? No, but it can't just be a simple majority if we send it back. They've already passed it, right? So how can we incentivize good governance to get passed again? Oh, well, we're going to make sure we can override a veto if there's enough people on board with it. But that's really, really hard, isn't it? Anybody out there know when the last veto override was?
Reagan, something.
Yeah, a long time, right? I don't even know. So it hasn't, if it's happened in my lifetime, it hasn't happened in the lifetime I remember. Let's just put it that way, right? So they're trying to make the gears of government grind against each other because they're counting on a constitutionally literate group of people to make sure and hold their government accountable. So that's kind of nice. Like, that's very philosophical. That's very theoretical, right? Those are good things to know and to think about. But also, more importantly, it's also important to know how the Constitution works and why, right? Not just what the goals are, not just that there are incentives and that they want to control them, they want them to fight against each other. They know that people love power, so especially the people that are elected into power, right? And that's kind of a key point, that they understood the people that are most interested in running for an elective office are probably the people that are most interested in gaining power. So we're worried about those types of people, and so how do we make sure that those people are actually fighting each other for power, right? So we can slow things down. Well, it's also important to know how the Constitution works, because the way it is set up is incredibly critical to how much power can be accumulated. There's a phrase that we like to use, the proper role of government, right? And we use that without understanding that the proper role of government was really outlined for us pretty well in 500 pages of very thick, dense, difficult to read material. And it wasn't come by easily, it was come by honestly. But we can kind of understand some of it if we just sit here and spend 5 minutes trying to think a little bit about it, right? If we sit here and think, okay, what's one thing we think the federal government should be in charge of? It'd be pretty easy to say, well, probably protecting the border of the country, right? That's probably number one. And it's not just easy for us here today to think about it, it's especially easy for a group of people who just fought a revolutionary war over the sovereignty of their border to also think that, okay, yeah, we can concede to that point, right? And we'll talk about this a little bit further on too. From a role of persuasion, that's a very critical place to start. It's very important to start with the most basic, most obvious place that we can. And they do, and they hammer it home often and quickly. They say, guys, we have to protect our border. That's a given. If somebody's invading Georgia, you think Maine is incentivized to help them out? Also, thinking back at the time when we didn't have interstates between the two, how long was it going to take some militia in Maine to get all the way down to Georgia? And then when they do get all the way down to Georgia, who's going to be in charge? Is it going to be Georgia that's in charge of defending their border? Well, it's Maine providing the troops. Shouldn't their general be in charge? So it's kind of obvious, right? Yeah, that's a role we want to give to the federal government because it's a good idea. That's not something we think the states will be incentivized to do, but there is something the states might like to do that we probably should give the federal government, right? They might be very inclined to create treaties, favorable bargaining agreements with foreign countries, right? I mean, if you're Florida and you're on the seaboard and you're really close to Spain, you're also relatively close to some of the British Empire, you might like to play both sides, right? It's going to make you more prosperous. You're going to be very interested in that. But that's not fair to New Hampshire, is it? If Florida has favorable trading with Spain and New Hampshire doesn't, well, what gives? Also, if we're making treaties and New Hampshire says, hey, you know, Britain, you're our number one trading partner, so I will have your back from now to kingdom come. Florida says, hey, Spain, we really like trading with you. You really like our stuff, so we have your back. And then Britain and Spain get in a conflict. Who's on whose side? That's way too difficult, right? So even though the states will want to have some sort of foreign influence, we need to make sure that they don't have that, right? It's very logical to give that right of the state away to the federal government and say, you know what, the federal government should be in charge of our treaties. They should be in charge of coining money. Again, it's really nice to sit here and say, well, that seems obvious. Well, when you're creating a government from scratch, kind of, but kind of not. Because each state was starting to coin their own money and was saying, we are sovereign, we'd actually be a little bit more interested in maybe like a loose confederacy, if you will. Because we want to run our state and our people want us to run the state better than you know how. So that brings us to kind of another important point, right? How do we make sure the states play nice together? Or at least play by the same set of rules, if you will. Because, you know, our states are still playing together pretty well, right? No? No, we don't have governors putting up billboards in other states and other governors saying move to our state and vice versa. We like playing in the same sandbox, right? Well, they knew that. Again, it's pretty easy to think about it now, but they knew that was going to happen because that's human nature. We're very tribal, if you will. We like our groups. We like our groups of people. Or we really dislike that group of people. We really like saying boomer sooner, and we really like saying no to Texas, right? If you're a Buckeye, you probably aren't the biggest fan of a Wolverine. Anybody here with that? We like our groups, and that's a good thing. We like our communities. We like our churches. We like our bowling leagues. I mean, has anybody ever played? I mean, that's the beauty about sports teams is it kind of encapsulates this in what should be a relatively benign way, right? I mean, who's picked up a bowling league injury because you don't like the other bowling team? Maybe nobody here, but I think we can all somewhat envision it, can't we? So we like our tribes, and sometimes when somebody does us wrong, we don't like the other group. So, who's in charge of governing what the states get to do? Well, again, that seems like a pretty good role for the federal government to take, right? Seems like if we have one referee that says, hey, just because you two don't like each other doesn't mean you shouldn't play in the sandbox together. Because there's a very real instinct for states to say, well, it seems like we're sending a ton of stuff up north and they're not really sending stuff down, and we really want their money in our district. So we're just going to tax everything that we send up to that state up there. Not the best way to play in the sandbox together, right? But again, these were the things that they had to think through and the things that they had to write. And again, things that remarkably still come back to us 250 years later. Even though we've had this around for 250 years, California is still trying to tax people that leaves the state retroactively for several years. They're not playing in the sandbox well. So we like to sit here and think that, like, oh yeah, this seems obvious, until a group of politicians sees a pot of money that they don't want to lose, or they see a certain amount of power that they don't want to lose, and then they say, you know what, maybe I don't want to play in the sandbox the same way anymore. I don't like how we're losing out on that. So we established that there is a proper role of the federal government in managing the foreign influence of the country as a whole. Again, seems kind of obvious when you give that power up to a federal government, they would take control of that. So we've already thought through that. We've already thought through, hey, we want the federal government to make sure everybody plays in the sandbox nice. That's really nice. So let's turn to everybody's favorite, taxes. Because everybody loves taxes, right? We are less than 6 months, no, a little bit more than 6 months away from tax day, so everybody's favorite day, right? Get your quarterly filings in. We love when the federal government comes to us and says, we need taxes, right? Well, you're not much different from folks that lived in 1787. They loathed the idea of taxes too. They loathed it to such a degree that even though they were fighting for the future of this country, they still said, you shouldn't be able to ask for more taxes and we're not going to give it to you. How difficult is it to tell somebody that taxes are a good thing? Does anybody want that job? But they are necessary, right? And even though we're in arguably an overtax situation, I think this group would probably all agree, right? We're in an overtax situation, they're still necessary. We still need them. Because if somebody were to show up on our coast and had bad intent, we're pretty happy that we're able to pay our soldiers to tell them to go away. Very forcefully, aren't we? We do kind of like that we can make sure everybody is scared of us, right? And there are things that the federal government does that are necessary. We do like when a judge sits down and says, no, the federal government should not be allowed to do that. Well, we have to pay for that salary somehow, right? Otherwise the judge won't be in office very long because he's got to go out and find a job. So taxes are a very necessary thing, and that's very difficult to write about. It's very difficult to convince a new country of. And so if you haven't read them already, it's a very interesting read when Publius gets to taxes and how they are a good idea and why we need them and why it's a good idea for the federal government to be in charge of them. Because again, one of the big objections at the time was that, well, we have our states collecting money, so why should I allow a federal government to get in the middle of that process? won't I then just be taxed more and more and more because the states are going to collect their taxes and now the federal government is? Why can't you just let the states do their thing? The federal government will be super small and away from here. And so they wrote the Articles of Confederation, and the federal government didn't have any money, and we nearly lost the war. And you and I arguably would be drinking tea today. So they're a good idea, but they're good when it's fulfilling the proper role of government. Now again, let's kind of transition maybe a little bit into, okay, this is all good, we got our proper roles, we have kind of how the Constitution works, but there seems to be some parts of it that seem a little made up, if you will. Like if you look at term lengths, it seemed like somebody just had a 6-sided die and said, Senate, 6 years. Let's see, who's really bad at throwing a dice? You can roll for the House of Representatives. 2, that's a good thing. 4, just, we'll split the difference, right? We'll have 4. And we've all seen it. We all know about it. There might be certain senators or representatives that say, hey, I need to be in office longer. I don't know why they chose these numbers. I don't know why they did what they did. And again, that comes back to our civic education, our constitutional literacy. If you just know that a Senate term is 6 years long, okay. But why is it? Why is the Senate longer? Couldn't just every part of our government be every 2 years and we just clear house and get it started again? Does it kind of halfway sound like a halfway decent idea? I mean, we're kind of probably thinking, that's got some merit to it, some, right? But how would we like dealing with a foreign government that clears house every 2 years? How easy would it be, in other words, to make a treaty with a foreign government that every 2 years their minds change because everybody said, whoa, we way overreacted, we elected the wrong people in, so now we're just going to swing that pendulum all the way over to the other side? You think foreign governments would be incentivized to create treaties with us? So, which branch of government should we give the longest terms to? And why? Well, the House of Representatives sounds kind of nice, right? It sounds like it's the people's house, so that might be the house that's best given the longest term lengths, right? They're most accountable to the people. That sounds like a pretty good idea, right? Not a bad argument. Except for we realize people are kind of fickle, and we tend to run with things at the spur of the moment, and then retroactively look back and go, that may have been a bad idea. By the way, we're not any different. Socrates had a lot of really good ideas, and Athens at the time said, whoa, you're pushing things too fast. Maybe we don't like you challenging our political thought at the time, so then they gave him hemlock, he died, and then they went, maybe that wasn't the best idea. So we're not new, right? We're not new. So people can sometimes be swayed by their passions. They can be swayed by events that happen and think something is a good idea in the short term and not have a long-term approach. So maybe not the House of Representatives. Should be fairly obvious why they didn't choose the executive to have the longest term, considering they don't like kings. Again, pretty easy to think we don't want one person in charge of everything and that be the face of our foreign policy necessarily. So what's so nice about the Senate being in charge of the long-term outlook of our country? Well, before we went and messed it all up and passed the 17th Amendment, they were elected by the state legislatures. And so they cared most about keeping state sovereignty, which the best way to keep state sovereignty is to make sure the whole nation is protecting each of the states. So maybe it's also a smaller deliberative body. There's less people there, so we can have better discussions. The Senate is supposed to be a little bit better at saying, hey, we're going to look at the long-term outlook of this country. We care more about protecting the state's rights. So we'll give them the longest term, and in turn, our country will have a little bit of an identity, or at least enough of one that foreign governments can say, they don't change out their senators a whole heck of a lot. So if we make a treaty with them, we're pretty sure that by the time the new senators come in, the old senators can sit down with them and say, this is why we did it. And maybe that'll be a good argument, maybe it won't. Maybe a treaty is just a bad treaty and we change out our senators and we get rid of it. But for the most part, that's going to be difficult to do with 6-year terms, right? So why did we pick 2 years for the House of Representatives? Well, we've kind of outlined that already, right? We want the House of Representatives to be most accountable to their constituents. We want the people to actually have a voice. So, you know the best way to incentivize an elected official to listen to you? Vote for them often. Show of hands, who sees their representative more than their senator? We got 2 brave souls. 3, 4, 5. Okay. One that has a little bit to do with the size, right? Our senators cover a much larger area, so that kind of makes sense. But also, they just aren't elected very often. So they don't really have to listen to us as often as our representatives do. That's why you see representatives come home a lot and go out and go to the county parties, and they go to the barbecue, and you'll see, I guarantee you'll see some of your federal representatives out here at Constitution Week, because they want to make sure that you know they're listening to you. And that's a good thing, to a certain regard, right? Because we have that Senate backstopping us. So we want them listening to us, and so we have shorter term links because we want you out there a lot, right? So why don't we do that with the president? Why don't we have elections, as was proposed, once a year for a new president? We see that now, how unbelievably political that is, but if you want somebody to not be a king-like figure, send them back out to be elected once a year. They do something unpopular year 1, they're gone. Right? That's not a half-bad idea. You mess up bad, you're out of there. You take too much power, you're out of there. We find out that you're doing something we don't want you to do. We find out that you're going after our rights more than we think you should. See you later. Conversely, one of the things that the president is in charge of is he's our head of state, right? Since it is one person, we'll get to that because that was also a fun debate. Since it's one person, it's kind of nice for that person to be in charge of representing our country whenever he travels abroad. Kind of difficult to send all the senators out with all their political ideas all the way over to Britain and say, hey, this is our representation of a country. So if the head of state isn't going to be elected once a year, if we're not interested in just throwing them out every time they do something bad, why don't we have a presidential term of 6 years? Because we're kind of balancing the two, right? We do want the president to be accountable to the people. But we also do kind of like the fact that there is a little bit of stability. We can count on the president representing us for a certain amount of time. So there is foreign policy involved. So we do want some accountability in that regard to our nation being represented. But we don't want so little of it that we're throwing them out once a year. So 4 years, seeing a lot of head nods, kind of sounds like a pretty good compromise between the two. believe it or not, there were actually debates for the presidential terms to be even longer. Because what happens when presidents change power? Do we have a lot of continuity of government, typically? Are there a lot of lessons learned that have to be relearned, if you will? So there's an argument to be made, for sure, of a presidential term being maybe even longer than the Senate, to maintain the proper role of the executive, to maintain continuity there. Luckily, I think we all agree, luckily they didn't do that. But one thing they did argue about, and this always fascinated me when I first ran across it, they did ask the question of, what if there was more than one? What if instead of one president, we had a group of people? Maybe you've heard of this in Roman times, they called it a consul, where we had 3 people in charge, right? Kind of an intriguing thought experiment, right? What if we had 3 people that were all 3 elected in varying term lengths in charge of our country instead of one person? I found it fascinating. Luckily, they also didn't listen to just fascinating ideas, and they said, hey, again, which of the 3 gets to go out and represent our country? Also, that kind of gets difficult in times of emergencies. What if all 3 aren't present when you find out something needs to happen and you don't have a quorum, and the 2 are fighting and say they don't want to do it? What if you get invaded and one person says, hey, we should go do something about it. The other says, I want to get all the info and the facts first. And the third guy is hosting the head of state of another foreign country or traveling abroad. What happens then? Intriguing idea, but luckily we settled on just one president and kind of changed the world a little bit in how they view the heads of state. When we were driving down here, it was, of course we timed it absolutely perfect to see all the changing the leaves and the aspen, right? Absolutely stunning country to drive through and to see all the different shades and colors coming along. And I've been kind of tracking it. I'm sure you've seen some of the maps that say, here's when the leaves will change colors. If you want to go through Telluride at this time, you need to go at this week. But of course, Grand Lake is perfect. They're going to schedule it right during Constitution Week. So everybody wants to come here for Constitution Week. I found it fascinating that we're even able to predict that. Isn't that pretty cool? That we know so well that we know when the leaves are even going to change colors, and we can kind of plan on when to schedule our visits to take our family to enjoy nature. Like Kim said, my son had to have a tooth pulled today, and so the tooth fairy came during nap time. Does anybody here not think he got excited about that? Why do we all know he got excited about that? Maybe a more intriguing thought experiment is, do you think a kid in the 1700s got excited when his parents came home with a present for him? Do you think any kid that's ever lived in the course of human history has ever not been excited whenever they got something? Why is that? And this is very fundamental to how you plan and build a country and a government. Because if you don't understand human history and human behavior, how can you plan for the future? And it seems like today we're kind of at this tipping point on this question of, are people genuinely, truly different from when we lived in the past, or can we shape them with government policy? Do people change fundamentally based on the government that they are in. And if you can plan for what somebody is typically going to do, well, it's really easy to create incentive structures for that, right? It's really easy to say, hey, we can plan on everyone being generous, sharing all of their money, and that nobody ever will ever take advantage of that situation at all. No? It just occurred to me, even the 12 disciples had somebody that liked money so much he wanted to steal it and try and get more of it. This question is thousands of years old. Even when you have a hand-picked group of people that you think are perfect people, they're still going to behave in similar ways if given similar temptations or incentives. When I first started reading this, I thought I was most going to pull out of it what's really, really cool about my Constitution. What I did not expect to pull out of it was how much they understood about life and how much we can learn from that. Federalist paper number 1 starts out in a really, really cool way. It basically sits down and it says, you, the reader, are incredibly unique. You're different than everybody else because you're reading this paper. You are interested in your government. How cool are you? I'm sure you, since you are so interested in your government, care most about instituting the best government that you can. I bet you are one of the best types of people that our country needs. Do you want to be a part of this really cool experiment where we try something revolutionary and new? Or do you want to be like some of the other people? Like, when we look back on the history of governments, we see them instituted really in kind of one way. Either accidentally, sometimes governments just come together, whether that's through necessity. You look at some of the Greek republics, they really came together accidentally because they were facing a Persian threat, right? They saw this huge, massive army and they said, hey guys, you want to work together? Might be kind of a good idea if we banded together. So we need some rules in how we play together. So let's figure that out, and let's figure that out fast because Persia's coming. So we kind of got this accidental governments, right? Or on the same side of that token, we have governments that were instituted through force. Somebody came in and said, I know best how to run your life, so listen to me. And then when the people said, whoa, I don't like how you're running my life, we're going to grab our pitchforks and run you out of town, they said, wait. Okay, we hear you. We'll change a little bit. Let's change a little bit. Let's do things a little bit differently. But I still kind of have the power, right? I have the force and the power to do that. In Federalist 1, he said, we have it totally different. You very cool readers, you very cool engaged citizens, you get the opportunity to actually pick your government. You get to vote on it. You get to tell us whether we have a good idea here or not. You get to use your reasoning and logic to do that. So how about you come alongside and we'll try and show you why. Is that a more effective argument than, hey reader, if you don't institute this government, we're all going to collapse into anarchy, Britain's going to raid us, and we're all going to die? Which one is more effective? Maybe a little bit of honey in there with your argument? Maybe we can learn a lot about how to effectively try and reach out to others who just need a little bit of an impetus to try and reach our same conclusions. Maybe if we add just a little bit more honey to our words, maybe if maybe if we assume that the person we're talking to also wants what's best for their life, and we say, hey, you know what, you're probably just like me. You probably want the best for your kids, right? Now, we may disagree a little bit on how we got there, but how about you listen to my idea? I'll listen to yours. But I know you're a good person. So why don't you try listening to maybe this idea? Pretty effective way to start out, right? Because I see a lot of that online and in the comments section. I see a lot of both sides of the aisle doing a lot of good complimenting, right? No, we don't use names that are cleverly mixed up with words suggesting that their intelligence level is maybe not on par with ours. The other interesting thing, and even though we're supposed to be apolitical, I think I know where most of this group falls on the political spectrum. Sometimes one side of the aisle likes to just be against things, right? And very interestingly, this is called the Federalist Papers because it was the Federalist Party. What they did brilliantly at the very beginning is they named their opposition the Anti-Federalists. They made their objectors against something, while Hamilton, Jay, and Madison got to advocate for something. They sat there and they said, we have a very industrious sea group. We have sailors that are really cool. Like, America is really good at the seas. We have a group of entrepreneurs that seriously want to change the world. They're really good at that. Why don't we enable them to do that and get government out of their way, but also protect them the ways that we should? They said, hey, we all lived through this war. We all lived through needing a stamp on every single piece of paper. We lived getting taxed on every single cent of our tea. How about we have this future where you don't have to worry about your children ever dealing with that ever again? Isn't that a pretty compelling future? But rhetorically, they did something even better for that than that. They sat down and they said, hey, it's not just enough to have something we want to fight for. Those guys over there, all they do is they whine, they complain, they object to everything we're proposing this government does, and they don't propose anything better. They propose that we just stay where we're at. Well, we've already covered that the Articles of Confederation are bad, right? We already agree we're headed in a bad direction with that. So if they don't propose anything better, they're just negative Nancy's. They're just folks we don't want to listen to. So don't listen to them. Listen to us. We have something we want to fight for. Pretty persuasive. They also use peer pressure pretty well throughout. Again, we've kind of talked about complimenting people. Hey, do you want to be part of a glorious attempt at a new country? They also use shame to paint the opposite picture. Hey, these Articles of Confederation have made us the laughing stock of the world. Do we really want to be a part of that? If you don't want to be a part of that national disgrace, you should vote for this Constitution. You should be for this. And again, the intriguing part about persuasion is that you do not force it. They said again in Federalist number 1, you can vote for this. You can say no. We're fine if you say no. But we want you to think about it first. Before you say no, you don't just listen to your neighbor and spout their ideas. We want you to sit down with our words. We want you to think through the things that we've thought. And we want you to say no because you're so educated that you've thought through it. And if you say no, then that's great. Actually, we would appreciate those people more than the people that don't even think about it and vote yes on the Constitution. Because we want those types of citizens the most. We have a republic that's built around virtuous citizens that will be active in their government. So we would rather you be active and against us in instituting this Constitution than the people that just sit there and say, yeah, Uncle Barney said this is a good idea, so I'm just going to hammer in my yes vote. Better than what we're doing, right? No, we want people that are involved in our Constitution. We want people that are reliant enough on their own thought that they're not relying on other people. And again, this goes back to the mob culture, right? An intriguing, I thought, a very cool example he gives right from the outset is he said, there's going to be people that are against this Constitution. There's going to be people that don't want to lose maybe money they've invested in the Articles of Confederation and the government as it's set up. Or maybe even worse, they don't want to lose the power that they have currently. So you should vote for this Constitution and not listen to those folks. But he throws in this interesting caveat, and a caveat I think we need to sit with for quite some time. He said there's going to be certain people that vote against this Constitution because they don't want to lose power. But not all of those people are necessarily motivated by power. Just because their situation looks like they want to keep power doesn't necessarily mean that's what they want. They could just be idiots. They could just be ignorant. They could just be going along with the flow. But they make the argument we're not going to assume negative intent into their actions. We're going to be better than that. We're going to say, I don't care what your intent is. If it's a good idea, I can arrive to it using my reasoning and logic, not using my passions, my emotion, just because I want it really badly. We're gonna say they're against a bad idea because it's a bad idea, not because they're bad people. And that might be a very important point that we can get lost in sometimes. Because instead of debating the idea, we're debating the people. Instead of telling people why something's a good idea, all I have to tell you is that that person is a bad person. All I have to say is that you're a communist, a Marxist, one of those terrible capitalists, and all of a sudden your ideas are worth nothing. I don't actually have to debate the idea. We need to learn to be self-reliant on thought, not just our passions, not just our emotions. I know we're running a little bit short on time, but all right. So, I want to make sure we get to this point too, because one of the Federalist papers that probably everybody has read is Federalist number 10, right? It's a pretty foundational one where they talk about factions. This idea of faction. And this word doesn't mean what probably everybody here associates it with, right? We kind of think of factions as, oh yeah, we divide up, right? We have our tribes, we have our factions, we have people that think a different way. But when you're reading through this book, that is not what factions actually mean. Factions mean any group of citizens, any group of people that want to take away the rights of another, or interested in being adverse to the rights of another. Any group of people. In number 10, Madison says, it doesn't matter if it's a majority or a minority. If you are a group of people that do not care about protecting the rights of another group of people, you are factious. And how do we best deal with factious people? Do we deal with it through fire and sword, as they say? Can you fight people? Can you use force against others to either take or to tell people that their ideas are bad? And very interestingly, especially in this moment, he compares politics and religion. He says we cannot, in politics, just like religion, make proselytes through fire and sword. We cannot cure heresy through persecution. It's like, okay, wow, those are really big words, right? Like, how do I sit with that sentence for a while? So maybe we all could think about it for just a second. How many of you, when your parents were trying to get you to do something different, and they yelled at you, all of a sudden said, oh, brilliant idea, Mom and Dad. We're going to change right away. How many of you had a boss that ever yelled at you because you did something wrong, or they thought you were doing something wrong and you should change? How many of you said, that boss man, he sure knows how to get to me. He sure knows how to change my ways. How do you make followers to follow a movement? Is it through persecution? Is it through beating them up and tearing them down? Has that ever been an effective way to win somebody over to your side of thinking? As a society, it's very easy, and Shakespeare harped on this a lot, it's very easy to take an eye for an eye. It's very easy to say, you're doing this to me to try and get me to think your way, so I'm going to force you to take my way. I'm going to use the power of government to force you to think that my way is the best way. And both sides do it. Both sides get into power and they say, no, I know the best way, so I'm going to force you to do it. Or you have a certain group of people that say, I know the best way, and if you don't think my way, well, I'm going to take away your right to life or the sanctity of your person. But that persecution goes a whole shade of different ways, doesn't it? And that human nature has not changed in the hundreds of years that we have existed as a country. So if we want to convince people that our idea is the best, the worst way to go about it is to use the power of government to convince them to do it. And it's very easy to want to do that, isn't it? It's very easy to say, well, they did this to me, so why don't I do it to them? It's very easy to say, well, you made the rule book. I'm just using the rule book you provided. I'm no different. When something happens in my life and somebody has broken the rules, I want to say, hey, you created the environment we're in. I'm just using your rule book against you. But is that going to win anybody over to thinking like a constitutionalist? Is that going to win anybody over to appreciating their country anymore? We have a lot to learn from the people that have lived before us. And we can try and reinvent the wheel and come to the same conclusions, or we can try and very difficultly read through a book that has a lot of good advice on how to convince our fellow citizens today to turn away from ideologies that conflict with the incentive structures that we know works with human behavior that hasn't changed for thousands and thousands of years. So I encourage all of you to be virtuous citizens, to be persuasive, and if you can, and you have time and want to work your way slowly through it, work your way through this book. So thank you all for coming out tonight.